registered. If your email address is not registered, that you are here for this, purely for the students who are registered for the lecture series, and also for the others, put your email because it may be useful sometimes if something happens. For example, this evening is bad weather, but our guest is here. Okay, and yeah, a second thing then. As last week also, on Friday morning at 10, there's a seminar SWSW 0205, okay?
25.
25, 0225. Okay, you are sure then?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Because I noted in my book it's 0205, but normally he is right. Correct?
Yeah, 0 to 25.
25, okay. Now, Erkan will present you Professor Nader Hashemi from Denver University. And he promised me, he said already he's a good speaker. Great.
Okay, thank you. Good evening to everyone. I'd like to thank to Professor Hashemi to accept to be with us today, this night. He is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies and assistant professor of Middle East and Islamic Politics at the University of Denver. He obtained his PhD from the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and previously was an Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern University and a visiting assistant professor at the UCLA at Global Institute. His research interests are the intersection of comparative politics and political theory, in particular debates on religion and democracy, secularism and its discontents. Middle East and Islamic, he's looking at Middle East and Islamic politics, democratic and human rights struggle in non-Western societies, and Islam-West relations. He is the author of Islam, Secularism and Liberal Democracy Toward a Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies, published by Oxford University Press in 2009, and co-editor of The People Reloaded, The Green Movement and the Struggle for Iran's Future, published by Melville House in 2011. And this evening he will discuss with us the question of after the Arab Spring, then there is a suspicion and doubts about the future of these revolutions and these springs, and that it has become an Arab winter. And the rise of some political Islamist parties and also Salafi movements in this region, after the dictators in Tunisia, Libya and Egypt, seems to suggest this question. And similarly in September, as some of you remember very well, after the controversial video appeared in YouTube, there were some demonstrations against Western, especially American and French embassies were attacked by some Muslim activists and fundamentalists. Then the question is still alive to think that is there really a democratic future in this region. And today, this evening, we will look at these questions with Nader Hashemi, and I'd like to thank again, and I would like to give floor to him. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy and honored to be at your prestigious university. I'm also very happy and honored to be part of this prestigious lecture series. I teach in the United States, and at my university we never hold a lecture at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, because American students will not show up at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and the fact that you all have come to this lecture at 6 o'clock in the afternoon suggests that students here in Belgium are more serious and interested in knowledge than my students back in the United States. So I'm happy that you've all taken the time from your busy schedules to come to this lecture. My objective in this talk, what I seek to do, is to discuss the crisis of religion and politics in the Muslim world today, to try and decipher it for you and to make it more intelligible. And what I seek to do specifically is to provide a historical framework for understanding the relationship between religion and politics in the Muslim world today, with an emphasis on trying to explain the rise of political Islam, or Islamic fundamentalism, or Islamism as it is sometimes referred to. In other words, why has political Islam emerged as the mainstream political formation for politics and not political liberalism? How does one, in other words, explain this huge chasm between the Western world and the Islamic world in terms of mainstream political movements? How can we understand this broad subject of Islamic fundamentalism, which after September 11th has become one of the most defining and important issues in international affairs? What is going on in Muslim-majority societies today that can help explain objectively this particular social phenomenon? Why is there a weakness of seeming absence of secular democratic opposition groups that clearly support a separation of church and state, that support European Enlightenment values, and that respect civil rights and human rights as we do in the West? Why are all, or seemingly all, of the mainstream opposition movements, some of them who have come to power as a result of the Arab Spring, why are they all Islamist or religiously based in terms of their fundamental political orientation? What is going on here? How can we understand this very deeply complicated and emotionally charged subject? Just to update the slides, that's the basic sort of breakdown and overview for my talk. And I want to sort of look at this question historically with an emphasis on lessons from European history. And I think any time you seek to explore a particular social phenomenon, you have to ask the critical question, why now? And why not before? In other words, is there a certain historic continuity throughout Islamic history over the last 1,500 years in terms of the emergence of militant, religiously based protest movements that are anti-state oriented, radical and revolutionary in their political agenda? Or, by contrast, are these events happening due to a particular convergence of a set of unique social conditions which are unique to a particular moment in history that is transiting, that is moving forward, and when viewed from the long term of history, this particular moment may not seem as important and enduring as many people believe. So the standard view that we often hear, more in the public intellectual culture, less so in the serious scholarship on the Middle East, the standard view that seeks to often explain and understand the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East at the end of the 20th century, early 21st century, that you often hear in popular culture, is that there is some unique and enduring problem within Islam. That Islam is allegedly anti-modern, it is anti-democratic, it has trouble adapting to modern values, and if that's not the explanation, there's a variant of that explanation that you sometimes hear. It could be something about Arab culture. There's a certain tribal, pre-modern orientation to it that prevents democracy from emerging and that produces these Islamic fundamentalist groups. In other words, another way of thinking about it and summarizing the general mainstream view that you often hear is there's an assumption in much of the debate in the minds of many people here in the West that if only the Middle East was populated by Buddhists instead of Muslims, we wouldn't be having these problems. Now, of course, it was mentioned in the introduction, the question of the Arab Spring has reintroduced the importance of this topic. Free and fair elections for the first time in Egypt and Tunisia, and what do you see? That the secular and liberal parties do very poorly, and it's Islamic movements, Islamic fundamentalist parties that win the popular vote and that come to power, and this has cast a lot of sort of concern, a lot of fear, a lot of question marks are being raised about the future democratic potential in the Middle East and North Africa as a result of the Arab Spring. So in short, what I want to do this evening, I want to sort of explain from a perspective that you perhaps haven't heard about. I want to explain sociologically, historically, and comparatively some of the background issues related to this poorly understood topic of Islamic fundamentalism. And please note that this is in no ways an apology or an excuse for the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, but it really is an attempt to look at this question from a new perspective and in a way that is in keeping with my own personal teaching philosophy. I tell my students that my job as an instructor is to get you to challenge your unexamined assumptions about the world. To challenge your unexamined assumptions about the world, and I want to do tonight is precisely that, challenge your unexamined assumptions about this particular topic. And I see some people have pen and paper in hand and they're taking notes. You're free to do so, but much of what I'm about to talk about is really taken from the first chapter of my first book that was mentioned on Islam and democracy, called Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy. So if you can't keep up with what I'm saying, you don't need to take furious notes. You can almost get a good summary from the first chapter of my first book. And I'd like to begin this lecture by telling you a story, a true story of an event that happened not far from where we are here, where we are located tonight. An event that took place about 500 years ago in a town that's located about 3 hours away from here, the German town of Münster. And this is a true story. On the 25th of February, 1534, the 25th of February, 1534, the German town of Münster was overtaken by Anabaptist zealots who established a radical theological dictatorship. Those who refused to undergo rebaptism were expelled without food or belongings in the middle of a snowstorm. The new regime restructured the local government by canceling all debts, burning financial records, and confiscating food, money, and other valuables. A new moral tyranny was imposed upon the citizenry, the most dramatic example being the burning of all books except the Bible. Blasphemy, seditious language, scolding one's parents, backbiting, adultery, and even complaining were now considered sins and punishable by death. Polygamy was instituted, and unmarried women were ordered to marry the first man that asked them. 49 women were executed and their bodies dismembered as a result of their failure to comply with this new law. A harsh dress code was also implemented. Houses were routinely searched and surplus goods confiscated, and it was not long before news of the plight of Münster was to reach the outside world. This is a true story I'm telling you. The Catholic bishop from the town of Münster managed to escape the town, and he recruits a mercenary army that surrounds and lays siege to the town of Münster. Confusion and chaos soon take over the town as the siege begins to tighten. And then from within the Anabaptist rebel ranks, a new leader emerges, popularly known as John of Leyden. One of the first acts was to call a town meeting in which he proclaimed, quote, "God has chosen me to be king over the entire world. What I do, I must do because God has ordained me. Dear brothers and sisters, now let us give thanks to God." End quote. As the siege tightened, starvation set in, and John of Leyden retained power through periodic prophetic outbursts, often invoking religious scripture. When this was insufficient, outright terror and brute force were his modus operandi, and all dissent was ruthlessly crushed. After a failed coup attempt, John oversaw the torture and the beheadings of the plotters. Their bodies were buried in 2 mass graves in the town marketplace. Executions and dismemberments were frequent, and the bodies of the dead were nailed to trees and gateways as a reminder to others. On the 24th of June, 1534, 4 months after the rebel takeover, Münster was finally liberated. The bishop's troops managed to capture John of Leyden, the rebel leader, alive, And over the next several months, he was led in chains from village to village as a prisoner of war. In January 1536, John was brought back to the town of Munster, and in a public ceremony, he was tortured to death with red-hot irons. And his body was then put in a cage and suspended over the church tower. And reportedly, if you go to Munster today, that cage still hangs there. Recalling the Anabaptist Munster uprising about 500 years ago is instructive in terms of shedding light on the contemporary problems of political development in the Islamic world today. The Muslim world today is at the beginning of its 15th century, approximately, in terms of its existence in comparison to the West. Or today the Islamic world is approximately at the same point where the West was in the 16th century. Around the time when Martin Luther, the key architect of the Protestant Reformation, makes his emergence on the world stage. Christendom in the 16th century, the early 16th century, like Islam at a similar age in its historical development, was marked by intellectual, political, and religious upheavals. In 1516, Sir Thomas More published his famous book, Utopia, a book that reflected new Renaissance thinking by posing fundamental and heretofore unexamined questions about the relationship between church, state, and society. A year later, Martin Luther rebelled against the Catholic Church, an event which officially marked the beginning of Protestantism. Early 16th century Europe also witnessed the emergence of a wide range of scientific discoveries and overseas exploration as the era of modern capitalism and colonialism began in earnest. 25 universities were founded at this time, and the printing press had published over 10 million books in various European languages. Soon the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation were to engulf Europe, dividing the continent both religiously and politically. Now, similarly, in the latter half of the 20th century, this period has ushered in profound social and political changes in Muslim-majority societies. The ending of the era of colonialism saw the emergence of many nominally independent new Muslim-majority states that over time have been marked by an abundance of military coups d'etats, interstate wars, revolution, an oil boom, foreign intervention, high rates of unemployment and urbanization, and growing socioeconomic inequality. The forces of economic and cultural globalization have significantly transformed the traditional way of life in many Muslim societies during the 20th century. And coupled with the general absence of democracy, this has produced numerous social pathologies, the most significant being the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. Historians who studied the early modern period of Europe write that there was, quote, nothing very unusual about the rebellion that occurred in Munster, or that it took the form of a religious movement. Similar events were common in medieval Europe. In other words, don't think that story of Munster was somehow non-representative of what was happening in Europe in the early modern period of Europe. It was very representative.